Ontario has a housing crisis, and that's no secret. It's the result of decades of inaction by previous governments.
The worst housing affordability crisis that our province has ever seen.
So during the pandemic, what happened was there wasn't a lot of inventory. A lot of people didn't want to sell their home because they didn't want random people coming through because of obviously COVID and everything, right? So since there was no inventory, a lot of younger buyers were trying to get into the market. A lot of first-time home buyers are trying to get into the housing market. And because of that, the housing market went on fire. Another factor was the government obviously put out a lot of money into the economy, right? So that was to kind of make it so it doesn't crash, but it kind of had a reverse effect where they put so much in that the housing market and all the assets kind of started rising. Not even just housing, even stocks and everything, right? They lowered interest rates like crazy during the pandemic, the lowest ever, which made made it easier for people to buy, right? So they increased the demand a lot. So now over the last few months, it started to steadily go up, and with that, we're seeing the demand obviously drop. We're seeing pretty big drops based on those areas that went up during the pandemic. A big factor during the pandemic was that a lot of people, they were working from home, so they didn't have to be in the city. So a lot of outer areas were booming. So places like Brock, I don't know if you heard of Brock, Beaverton. No, it's really far out there. Beaverton, even London, Kingston, Oshawa, those are they doubled basically, right? So for them, the value was a bigger space, and since it's a lockdown, you don't really need to commute or everything. Restaurants were closed, you don't need to be there or anything.
We've been hearing that there's a supply issue in regards to housing, and that we're not building as many houses, and people there's a lot of demand for not that much supply. And also right now, as you talked a little bit about the interest rates going up, I suppose the cost of building houses is also going to increase, so that's going to affect the market as well. So
interest rates going up, obviously it's going to affect it, because at the bottom line, your monthly payments will go up, right? Because of that, home prices can't go that high, because you can't, no one can afford a $5,000 a month payment, right? So something that was $3,000 or whatever would go up. So because of that, the actual home price will go down. We're already seeing that happening from February to April. February was kind of the peak. Since then, after they raised the rates, it started to go down a bit. In terms of supply, so honestly, Canada gets a lot of immigration too, right? So we're getting 400,000 new people every year. So we do need a lot more housing. I think in Ontario, for example, we built 70,000 homes, if I'm not mistaken. The only issue is that the homes that we're building, they're either condos or they're building huge homes far away. So I personally think, this is just my theory, but I think what they need to do is they need to end, there's a type of zoning that we have here in Toronto, which is really dumb, but it's 70% of Toronto has this, it's called yellow belt zoning. So it's you can only build single family homes. So it doesn't make sense to build single family homes right beside subway stations, for example, right? So what we're getting is we're getting mansions beside subway stations where people could actually I don't know if you said you've been to Montreal a few times, right?
Yes.
So you would see those 3-4 floor multiplexes. We need more of those to make housing better, right? We need more of those near transit. We need to end that zoning where it's kind of excluding people and then making people live farther away, and then increases traffic and everything. Where if we make it more dense, and I'm not talking about high-rise towers, because that's kind of too much as well. It's more medium density. We need 3 to 4 floor type of homes, which will actually even more townhouses, more mixed type of housing that will help people, right?
One thing I want to get your opinion on is a lot of people don't like those zoning laws, because they kind of increase the value of their home, right? Because if you're in a market where there's not a lot of supply, and there's a lot of demand, your house becomes more valuable to you. And for many people, their houses are their wealth. They build their wealth through their houses and their condos and whatnot. So you're thinking of your retirement, and you're saving as being in the house instead of the house being just the house where you live.
And I think that's a huge issue in Toronto as well. It's called NIMBYism. So it's not in my backyard. I don't know if you've heard of that. But basically in Toronto, it's huge because it's they want like they don't want like even like multiplexes near them, or like they just want this single family neighborhood. They don't want their values to drop because obviously they're saving up for retirement and everything. But it's like we got to look at the bigger picture, right? This is not actually supposed to be an investment, right? It should be a place, like everybody should have a place to live initially, and then after that, if there is like place for investment, that would be where it's like you can get cash flow, like monthly cash flow, instead of looking for the appreciation aspect of it, right? So there is opportunity for that, where it's like you can own like a few type of multiplexes, and then you get that monthly cash flow without expecting that appreciation. So that happens like all over the world. But here it's like we've become so addicted to that appreciation, where it's like kind of getting ridiculous. Like where can it go from here, right? Like it's like you're buying a home for 2 million or 1 million. It's like you expect it to go like 3. Like who can afford these homes, right?
I was looking at the report from the housing task force, and they talked about how the past 10 years housing prices have almost tripled, right? And then you look at the rise of income, income is not catching up to the housing prices, right? And then so one thing the government is trying to tackle is, you know, foreign ownership, vacant homes. So by raising those taxes, they think that could help solve the issue. Another thing they're talking about is cutting the red tape for, you know, developers. Yeah. So when you look at, let's say, those 3 things, do you think that could help fix the affordability issue, or
I feel like those things that they're talking about, especially like the foreign buyers, I think that's just like a scapegoat, right? So I personally think like foreign buyers, they can't vote for you. So that's why they're like, okay, this would be a good scapegoat, but they don't represent a lot of the buyers, to be honest. Like maybe like 2 to 3%. So it won't have as much of an effect as people think it is. It's just a way for them to be like, oh, we're doing something here, right? At the end of the day, like the main thing that they should be doing is like ending that type of zoning, it'll make the cities better too. It would actually make Toronto a better city. Like if it didn't have all these single family homes like on all these homes, like on these major streets, right? Make it easier to put in transit. It would make traffic better. It would make quality of life better. But instead they're doing things like and like, you know, like banning foreign buyers and like trying to make it seem like they're doing something, right? But I don't think that's really, the vacant tax isn't that bad, but at the end of the day, if they just do this, they don't have to do things like that, right? It's like almost like putting like tape over, like, you know what I mean? Instead of just fixing the whole problem.
In terms of young people like myself, that some of them kind of feel disenfranchised by the market. They realistically, I was just looking at a survey, like a lot of young people,
they don't think they can buy.
They don't think they'll be able to buy a home, right? So your thoughts on that as young people, you know, either it's Gen Z or young millennials trying to get into the market and feel like they can't get in. Like, what would be your tips for them taking those little steps to get to that point?
So I would say, like, honestly, it is hard, and I get it. Like, it's so hard to get into the market now, right? But what I would suggest is obviously to try and save up. Like instead of spending too much on other things, maybe trying to buy with friends, as well as like even buying a type of home that they don't like expect to be their dream home, but just getting your foot into the door. Like what I always say is like, if you get into the market, you can at least go up and down with it, right? So at least if you have like even a condo unit, or if you even have some like a smaller space that you like, that's not in the location that you fully desire, at least you're kind of going with the market. And then going forward, when you start building equity, you can take that equity and then sell this place and buy into what you actually want to buy.
What would you like to see in terms of sustainability in real estate?
So I think like sustainability is like a huge thing like for everybody. So there's no point having a home if the world's gonna like, you know what I mean? Like it's gonna get like, in the next few years, we're gonna see a lot more climate change, like things happening. Like I know Toronto is safe from a lot of things, but most of the world isn't. So whether it's like floods or whether it's like rising temperatures, there's so many factors that are going to be happening to the world. So I think like everybody has a key part to play in sustainability. So for me, it's like while I was doing real estate, I'm like, this is a way for me to kind of give back, where it's like every time I help somebody buy or sell a home, I plant 100 trees. So that way I can look back and be like, wow, like I actually planted like thousands of trees. Like it's like, at least I try to do something to kind of combat this. And I think personally though, like I think more new developers should get into sustainable projects as well, making sure people like are like net zero. So basically don't put out carbon when they have their home, and it gets recycled. Like if we're building new homes, we might as well do it like that, right? Like there's no point building homes without that aspect, but obviously most people aren't doing that. Cost is another issue too for them, but I hope to see more of that in the future. Another thing I mentioned was even with that yellow belt thing, that would help a lot with sustainability. Like there's no reason for somebody to live like 2 hours away and drive every day, right? If you make it more dense, it's better for the planet, it's better for everybody involved, it's better for like the people themselves. They get to walk more, they get everything's near them. Like it just makes so much more sense.
Canadian military personnel sent into nursing homes here in Ontario have observed shocking conditions, the details of which are outlined in documents sent to the federal government in Ottawa.
I have talked to people who've said this is worse than anything that they've seen overseas, that they were astounded this was happening in Canada.
Concerned Friends actually has been around since 1980. So the history goes back a long time when a small group of people got together because they were concerned about the quality care in long-term care homes. I joined Concerned Friends 2.5 years ago, shortly after my mother passed away in a long-term care facility. She was 80, she suffered a stroke and left our family unable to care for her. She was living in assisted living before that. At that point, we're talking about pre-COVID, the challenges within long-term care. So my background is as a retired executive director. I felt the need to become more involved in advocacy of how do we make change to the long-term care system.
What is that process like for when families or a potential resident is looking for a long-term care home? What is that process like? What are the decisions what are the factors that influence their decisions?
I can speak personally. My mother was living in assisted living, had a stroke and could not return to that. So while we had already identified that at some point she would need to go into long-term care, the critical happened when she was hospitalized and then need to be placed in long-term care. So you're looking at families that are considering, where am I going to go for my, it is end of life, right? It's those later years when you need more personal care. Obviously, aging at home is the preference, but medical needs take you in a different avenue. So you are looking at what what long-term care homes are in your area. You're going to be talking to other family members that might have their loved ones. You're going to have to do all that research. How many people are living in there? What is their emergency plans? What is the staff to resident ratio? What programs do they have? Depending on the medical needs of the individual, certainly will also dictate where you go. The needing to be ending up in long-term care while you're in hospital is a bit different. And I think it depends on whether you've already started the process, which we had, so it made it a little easier that we had identified some homes, versus a person who all of a sudden finds their loved one in a medical condition that they can't, and they need to go to a long-term care home. You're looking at it in a crisis perspective, and it's very difficult to make some of those decisions. So there are lots of questions to ask, touring the facilities, looking at their inspection track record, talking to the family council members, talking to resident councils.
Could you talk to us a little bit about the key differences between privately owned, publicly owned, or non-for-profit long-term care homes?
That discussion of privately owned, publicly owned, not-for-profit, that discussion has been around for a very long time. Ultimately, I think we can all agree that healthcare should be publicly funded, but there is a reason that we do have privately owned and the capital investment required. To us, it's about not who owns the facility, it's about the level of care that has been being provided. And you can see some privately owned ones that aren't doing as well of a job, but that would say the same for, you can't judge it by the ownership type. There are things in place, the government licenses every single long-term care home. They provide funding, they have regulatory oversight. So if the quality of care is not being provided, they have tools. So really, if they're not using the money appropriately to boost the level of care that's being provided, that's where we need to go. Not, it's lots of discussion around the ownership type, but to me, it's the government oversight. COVID had, you saw some large facilities that did well, like with the number of residents that weren't infected. Certainly the older buildings, the 4-bedroom shared accommodations with a cloth curtain separating, was a significant risk. Congregate dining areas, the whole, the way that the homes, the eating, 4 people are sitting at your table. It's just, you don't have that space. You didn't have that luxury to do the physical separation that, we were all put into as residents, right? As residents of our own home, we were finding ourselves wanting to put that physical distance in. Certainly airflow and ventilation, air conditioning. And again, it goes to, the age of the facility, the investments made.
And I was seeing that there was a demand for like implementing a minimum of 4 hours of hands-on care per day. So it had me asking myself, what is the minimum amount of hands-on care given right now? Like, what is the standard?
A number that I've come across is 2.75 hours.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thought behind that, and it's not an average of 4 hours of care, there needs to be a minimum of 4 hours of care, direct care per resident, recognizing that, depending on physical needs, mental needs, that ranges. But at minimum, I can tell you from firsthand experience, 6 minutes allocated to personal care for a person who, is immobile, needs somebody to brush your teeth, brush your hair, get you dressed, get you repositioned into a chair, find your clothes, which, all of those things. Can you imagine having to do that in 6 minutes? And that takes 2 PSWs to assist with that. So it comes down to, not only is it the 4 hours of care, which we all can appreciate and want, we have to get these people. We're all facing a critical labor shortage in all sectors. And this one has been hit, one of the hardest. And we can throw money at this, which is needed, but we also need to look at a recruitment program of how we're going to get, the students involved in looking at this as a career opportunity.
You talked a little bit about the public support, public attention, and the support that was given to long-term care advocacy prior to the pandemic and now during the pandemic. Could you talk a little bit more about that and the changes that you're seeing and why it took so long for people to come around to this important issue?
I can't speak for others. We've done a lot of research and there's reports, and we can go back to 2015, 2016, the provincial auditor. We've all recognized the shortcomings within this long-term care system. We can point fingers at different political parties. It was their fault. I also hold ourselves as citizens of Ontario accountable for not keeping the finger on the pulse on that one, because it took a pandemic for us to recognize that, the quality of care wasn't there. When I can tell you personally, I had 2 parents that passed away in long-term care, and I can tell you that it was amplified during COVID, but the challenges existed prior to that. So what's going to change this time is us as Ontario citizens keeping the pressure on and not getting caught up in the election platforms that we're going to be involved in. We need to value our aging population and recognize the contribution they have made and care for them properly.
We have therefore made the assessment that COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
It is now official. Canada has its first confirmed case of the new strain of coronavirus. A man in his mid-50s in Toronto. His wife is also suspected of being ill and is awaiting test results.
This morning, I've declared a state of emergency in the province of Ontario. We're facing an unprecedented time in our history.
So every now and then there's, a virus starts and then we go, is this the next big one? Is this is this going to be it? Often there's a sense, okay, no, it's not. It's more isolated. It's not. Even SARS-1, which did become, it had a big impact, for example, in Toronto, but it didn't become like COVID. And I think a lot of us sort of felt, okay, well, it's restricted to this region in China. It's not a particularly severe thing. It's sort of like a bad flu. A lot of that discussion was around early on. In our department, I think we took it fairly seriously. There was a lot of discussion about what was going to happen. Well, two things. One is to how to finish out that semester. So, the courses were still underway and suddenly everyone's being sent home. And that's where that infamous word pivot, became widespread. We're pivoting to an online format. And there was a lot of discussion about how to get through that end of that semester. And then there was discussion about what might this mean for the upcoming fall semester, September of 2020. And I think a lot of universities, a lot of faculty, instructors, sort of thought, okay, we just need to get through this and then we're back to normal. Whereas at least in our department, we kind of said, let's take it seriously and let's try to have some guiding principles for how to handle this. And one of them was, let's not develop a whole bunch of new educational approaches that are only useful for one semester.
In terms of this still being a pandemic, did you think we would still be dealing with that 2 years later?
I didn't. I had a lot of hope in vaccines, and so I knew that a lot of groups were working hard on vaccine development. Vaccines didn't solve it, and maybe it was naive to think they would, given sort of how this virus evolves, which is very quickly. And this is probably one of the most important things, is we did not roll out vaccines everywhere. I think the approach, which I mentioned the experience of watching the US rolling out their vaccines, and we were lagging far behind, and it was getting very frustrating. This sort of national or even provincial division in how things are handled is a big part of the problem, I think. So, if you look at vaccine rates in Africa and other developing parts of the world, it's very low, and some of that is hesitancy, which I think is well earned through the history of colonial medicine. But at the same time, it's access, and we just haven't provided. They've not lifted patents. We've not lived up to our promise of global vaccination, and I think we're seeing how enormously problematic that is, not just morally, but it means you will not defeat a virus like this locally. A pandemic is not local by definition.
I'm curious if you know why COVID was such a virulent virus, and why it evolved so quickly.
Two different properties of a virus that you might be interested in. So transmissibility is one, which is sort of how easily and rapidly it can spread among individual hosts. And then virulence, which is how much damage it does to the host. It has a high mutation rate. So that means that a lot of mistakes get made when it's being replicated and they're not corrected. It has a small RNA genome, and those tend to be pretty error prone. And it's present in very large numbers within individuals who get infected. So one group did an analysis. They tried to estimate basically how many copies of the virus are there out there in the world right now. And looking at, that's a combination of how many hosts are infected with it, and then how many copies are there in a host when they get, when they're fully infected. And they calculated, it's basically enough out there to have every single possible, at least single base mutation happening and being transmitted to a new host every day. Another factor is that you can transmit it asymptomatically. So if you're, let's say you get a virus and it basically incapacitates you rapidly, you're not able to walk around and spread that to others.
In Ontario here, we have vaccines. Lockdowns are pretty much, or restrictions have been pretty much very, very, very loose. Do you believe we're moving too fast?
Herd immunity, was that ever a viable option? I do remember hearing about that quite a bit. And especially the notion that once you have a combination of vaccination and prior infection, you'll hit a certain point. So the idea of herd immunity is there's just enough of the population that's now immune that it essentially contains any further outbreak, because there's just not a lot of available hosts anymore. A couple things that are so there's a few reasons why that isn't working and won't work, and one of them very clearly is that you can get reinfected. Immunity wanes regardless of whether it was through vaccination or prior infection, but reinfections now, in a month you can get it again. So that's not going to be possible. In terms of lockdowns, I mean, I don't know that you could say we had hard lockdowns in Ontario. We had some, we had schools shifting to remote. We had stores were closed, and you had to pick stuff up curbside, and we certainly had a number of restrictions, but we didn't have anything like what you saw in China or even in Australia and other places. The flip side is removing those protections. So I think there are a number of things that are moving too fast.
Do you think that politics has kind of entered your field of science? Because obviously the provincial people and our leaders, they make decisions, quote unquote, based on what they're getting told by their medical board, etc. But also they make their own decisions too. So it's a mix. It's a mix. So do you think it's entered the field of science?
Never been free of political influence. Science, first of all, I mean, science is done by humans, and humans are not, unbiased. And so we have structures we try to work within that in science, but there's always various biases, the kinds of questions you ask and the kinds of things you study. When Omicron arose and was first detected in South Africa, doesn't mean it arose in South Africa. South Africa has a very sophisticated surveillance system for pathogens, and they found this variant and reported it to the world. And how did we react? We banned travel from a bunch of African countries, including ones where it had not been detected yet. I'm a little bit surprised at how much it is in this area, and how willing certain medical professionals seem to be to go along with it. Like, there's a lot of what some people are describing as sort of minimizing happening right now. That, it's not that bad, and the rates are coming down. And a lot of people were very wrong about what would happen with Omicron, or did not think there would be one. They thought you can go back and look at, a year ago, statements from top level public health leaders in various countries who are like, okay, it looks like you can return to normal. We've got vaccines and stuff. And then Omicron hit. There's political, and then there's also, I think, this notion of messaging. Let's maybe not call it necessarily political, but there is a priority within, I think, public health to keep people from experiencing undue fear. And lots of times that probably makes sense, but it can go too far. And so, for example, the World Health Organization in 2020, said we're going to call it the virus that causes COVID-19. We're not going to refer to it as SARS-2. And one of the main reasons we're not going to call it SARS-2 is that causes anxiety, and it can create stigmatization, say, of Asian populations because of SARS-1. So there's a decision that's not a scientific decision, right? That's a communication, psychological, sociological decision.
How do we see this ending? How long are we going to be dealing with the virus, or does it completely die out like we seem to believe?
We are not trying very hard at this point to influence the outcome. I think we're kind of accepting what happens. And the problem with that is that when you don't engage in mitigation, when you let there be these big waves, and you let some parts of the world go unvaccinated and so on, then that's where you get new variants arising. People will start to get more clued into the risk of long COVID. So that's also been heavily downplayed, but there's increasing number of studies kind of indicate. There's one that just came out from the CDC that was saying that 1 in 5. That's worse than roulette, like Russian roulette. I mean, a 1 in 5 is not a good odds, and if it's 1 in 5 every time you get infected, and you can get infected multiple times per year, you know, I don't know how we're going to handle, even if it's just people being sick, you know, kind of fatigued for a month. Like, that's the best case scenario. That said, I am optimistic about a few things. There's next generation vaccines that are under development. So nasal sprays, for example, that actually do confer protection against infection. One of the issues with the current first-gen vaccines, I mean, they were designed against original COVID, right? So, or SARS-CoV-2. So they're not necessarily effective against the new variant, or as effective, I should say. They are effective at preventing severe illness and death and so on, but they're not really stopping transmission the way we would need. Some of these newer ones, though, may mitigate transmission, which is really important, right? Keep the cases down, fewer replications happening out there, fewer new variants. My sort of view is, like, hold the line, because there's reinforcements coming. There's new vaccines, there's vaccines for kids, there's ventilation improvements, there's antivirals. You know, we've got more tools coming. We just need to kind of hang on a bit longer and protect the people who are most vulnerable.